chunky. Oh man, I love coil shocks.
What's up everyone? Mark here from Jenson USA to bring you the next installment in our video series all about suspension. This is going to be our episode 2, which is all about breaking down air versus coil. Woo, that was close, but we still got it on there. We're going to break down not the forks, but actually the differences between air versus coil. And if you like all this stuff we're putting out and you want to see us keep putting these series out where we're breaking down the hard questions that you're facing out there in the cycling community, make sure to like and subscribe, give us a follow on our social channels. We love all of that. So let's dig into this. All right. Now here for our episode 2, it's air versus coil. And this is the big debate that we're gonna experience out in the cycling community when you're out there looking to buy a bike, or maybe you're looking to switch around your bike. Do I run air? Do I run coil? It's the big question. And we understand that here. So what we're gonna do in this episode is we're gonna break down all the details in the 101, I guess you could call it, of air suspension and all the 101 of coil suspension and how these might fit your riding style and help you make the decision on which one to ride. All right, now before we begin and start diving into the details and facts between air versus coil, I wanna make a quick statement. And that's that we're gonna skip over a lot of the basics here of overall suspension, what tuning is, what all these different terminology as far as rebound and compression and sag and all that. And so if you're interested in learning more about that and you haven't already, make sure to check out our episode 1. The link will be down in the bio or it'll pop right up here on the screen. All right, so let's start with what do they have in common? Now this is pretty simple, right? Because they both aim to give you the proper ride. They want to give you the proper feel on the trail. That is the overall goal, regardless of whether it's air or coil, right? But together, let's think about it. It's like a symphony, dun, 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 of valves, bleeder valve stems, rebound, compression, all these different things, right? They all work together to give you that valve, to give you that feeling, I mean. So we understand that they all are gonna share those same qualities, but I know you're asking, what is the difference? So let's get into the differences right here. All right, so let's first get into coil suspension and the specifics around it that make it different from air. The first primary thing here is that it actually uses a metal wound coil spring here. Now, with these springs, you have to understand that each spring has a specific stroke and weight to it. Now, these are sometimes listed directly on the spring, other times they're just listed in the manufacturer's packaging. And with these help determine your sag and your rebound according to the suspension of the bike. So let's get into what stroke length means and the weight of the spring and how these affect your riding. All right, so for example, we have this RockShox coil. Now, almost hit it again. It's gonna be the whole video, y'all. I'm gonna hit this and we're just gonna go with it. With the RockShox coil, we're gonna see right here on this coil aspect of it, some printed numbers. Now, the first number being here is 350. This is the weight of the spring in which pounds it takes to compress through the first 1/3 of the spring. Now the second set of numbers here is 57.5 to 65 millimeters. This is the overall stroke length on which it can compress together. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna use these to determine how to set your sag and the overall rebound within your rear suspension to get the best feel on your ride. All right, so with coil suspension, the coil compresses at a linear rate. It's gonna basically move through its entire travel consistently through. Now, there are other companies out there and manufacturers such as MRP, Cane Creek, and I'm sure a multitude of others that offer this new innovative technology of a progressive spring. And by progressive, what I mean is as it moves through its travel, it's going to get progressively, see terminology here, harder through its travel. So I just wanted to add that there. When you're thinking about it, remember that a coil spring is typically a linear movement through its travel, and then we'll get into the full understanding of progressive travel and suspension here in just a second. All right, so moving into air suspension and the basics around it, let's take a minute to recognize that air suspension and suspension in general is going to be similar overall, like we briefly mentioned, right? It's the symphony of different systems working together. But what air suspension does here is they swap out your typical coil type of travel with a stanchion that acts to hold air and create an air-like spring as it moves through its travel. And what this does is as the wheel is moving, it's basically plunging through this stanchion, this area right here, and it's allowing it to eat up all that different chatter and stuff you're experiencing on the trail. Now, like I previously mentioned in the coil aspect, coils are linear where air is more of a progressive feel. And what I mean by that is as it travels through, if we break it down into thirds, it's going to get progressively more stiff. So as it goes through the first, this is going to be your low speed. It's going to basically travel through that a little bit faster, but as it gets deeper and deeper within your travel, it gets more and progressively harder. So this is something to consider if something like bottoming out is an issue or something like that. So let's get into a little bit more about what air suspension and how it differs. All right, so just to get into a little bit more detail here in case I didn't, basically elaborate enough on this, is the idea of an air shock is that with the air volume within the chamber here, or the air spring as we can call it, as the stanchion progresses through the travel, the volume reduces. And what that volume reduction does is it pushes back harder on your bike to push it out of that travel, right? So that the pushback is kind of like when you're a kid and you keep pushing your parents' buttons because you know you really want that ice cream, and no matter how hard you push, they always push back harder. So think of that as an air suspension kind of feel. It's the progressiveness. As you push through and reduce that volume, it's going to push back harder and harder to bounce you out of that situation. But when it comes to this type of things, you also have to understand that whether it's coil or air, your frame's ability plays hand in hand with the overall feeling that you're going to get. And there's 3 stages here, and these have to do with the leverage ratio with your bike and your suspension. Whether that's progressive, like we mentioned before, typically an air shock is progressive. Whether that is linear, like we talked about with a coil shock, or the last option is regressive, which we'll get into here in just a minute. So let's first start by getting into what a leverage ratio is and the difference in qualities it has with your bike. All right, so you may be asking, well, what's a leverage ratio? I was only coming here to understand what's coil, what's air, and which one should I pick. But we want to make sure here at Jenson that you understand the full depth of your decision and that you make the right decision. In order to do that, we need to break down some of the actual kinematics and understanding that goes into when manufacturers are creating bikes and linking them with suspension systems. In order to do that, we need to understand what a leverage ratio is. And a leverage ratio in its most simplest form is it's the relationship between the rear suspension and the movement by force of the rear wheel, touched it again, as it moves through its travel, right? So for example, if say you have a suspension and a leverage ratio on your bike that is 3:1, for every 1 inch that your rear suspension, so for example an air shock, for every 1 inch that it travels through, your rear wheel will move 3 inches. So let's get into a little bit more of an example there on how this might affect you as a rider. All right, and if you're maybe curious about what your exact bike's leverage ratio is, or maybe the bike you're looking at purchasing, we're gonna make sure to put a link down below where it's an amazing little blog site that has every bike listed down with its leverage ratio, and you can see it on a curve, you can compare it to the other bikes and kind of figure out exactly where you're at, and so you understand when you're making your decision of air versus coil. So be sure to check down below in the bio for that link. All right, so as we get into example here, let's just make sure that we understand that basically the leverage ratio is the force of magnitude needed to compress and gain travel out of your suspension. So as an example, if we have a 150-pound rider and they're on a 3-to-1 leverage ratio bike, they would need 450 pounds, for example, coil here to compress through that first set of travel.
Boom. 2 + 2 is 4, -1, that's 3, quick maths.
Now, to make it a little bit more confusing, yet a lot more understandable, is that this is an average. So the 450 pounds here in the leverage ratio is only an average to the overall bit of travel. It can change through every third, if we break that down in threes, idea of what's going on here. So let's get into a little bit more on progressive leverage, and then we'll get into from there linear leverage, and then from there we'll finalize on regressive and how all these can affect you on your ride. All right, so when we're talking about progressive leverage ratios, basically what this means is that as the travel is moving through its overall movement, it's going to get stiffer the farther it travels down. It's going to progressively get harder. So when we're thinking about these ratios, this is the combination of the rear wheel of the frame and its relationship with the rear shock. Now, if we look at this in a sense of our example previously, say we have the 150-pound rider and they're riding a 450-pound terms of suspension pressure, it may become a 2-to-1 as they get halfway through their suspension, right? Because it's going to progressively get harder. So when you're looking at ratios, for example, if you know that your frame is a progressive frame in the movement of that rear wheel, and you team it with, say, a linear coil suspension, they're going to fit hand in hand, right? It's that firm handshake together to make sure that you're getting terms such as ramp up or bottom out protection or progression. And these are what you're looking for when it comes to a progressive idea of leverage ratio. With the linear leverage ratio here, what this means is basically we want to make sure that we don't have the same linear movement of travel throughout the entire suspension system. And by this, so a coil by itself is a linear movement of travel. I keep saying the same words over and over again, but I hope that they make sense. And basically what I'm trying to say is that as the spring goes through its movement, it's going to be the same amount of force as it goes through because the volume is not being reduced, and so it's not getting the same amount of pushback that gets harder as you push down. So we would not want to take a linear coil suspension and pair it with a linear bike. Basically what that would do is we would have a lot of trouble bottoming out. So if we're hitting, you know, big ramps, if we're doing big drops, we're doing some pretty gnarly stuff on here, having two linear pieces together is not going to give us that protection in those real sudden impacts that maybe we really want to have that ramp up and that rebound right back out of. So when we're thinking about a linear leverage ratio and we want to run that coil suspension, we're going to want to pair that with a progressive frame. So when we put those together, they balance each other out and it's still going to give us that ramp up. So another example here with linear leverage ratios is, say if you have a linear frame, you would want to pair that with a much more progressive air shock. So like this Fox X2, Float X2 here, amazing progressive air shock. If your bike's super linear, then maybe air is exactly what you need because it's going to give you that bottom out protection and allow that bike to ramp up accordingly how it's meant to ride. So if you have a linear bike and a linear frame, go with the progressive air to get that ramp up. If you have a more progressive frame, go with that coil because what it's going to do is it's going to help team with that and give you that progressive ramp up as well. All right, so move into our third point of leverage ratios, and this is the regressive leverage ratio. With the regressive leverage ratio, it's basically as the rear wheel moves through its travel, it gets easier, right? So for example, if we go back to our 3-to-1 ratio earlier, say you start at the top of your 1/3 of your rear suspension, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. As it moves further down through its travel, it becomes a 3-to-1 ratio. So although it's very uncommon that bike frames are more of a regressive leverage ratio here, if it is that way, make sure to team it with a progressive air shock because this is going to help balance it out. So remember, with a regressive leverage ratio, team it with a progressive air shock. It'll help balance that out, because what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have that bottom out progression. So let's conclude on all the points we have here. All right, so let's summarize the 3 points here on leverage ratios. The progressive leverage ratio is typically you want a linear or a progressive frame with a coil shock is a bike with ramp up. That's a good thing. If you take a linear frame with a progressive, say air shock, you get a bike with ramp up or bottom out support. That's a good thing. If you have a regressive frame and you team it with an air shock and say extra volume reducers to even give you more support, you're gonna get a bike with ramp up. And the overall goal here and the understanding behind leverage ratios is to ensure whatever rear suspension you put on there, you're getting a bike that ramps up the further it gets through its travel, to ensure you're not bottoming all the way out, or you're hitting those really stiff moments that you don't want to experience on big, technical terrain. All right, and I just want to add a really cool thing that's starting to come up in the mountain bike community, and that is progressive coil shocks. Specifically, companies like Cane Creek here, they've been starting to come up and develop a very progressive spring, which gives you that real supple feeling in the beginning of that travel, and then progressively gets more bottomless or ramps up as you progress through the spring. These are really cool things that are starting to come up, which give you that great feeling that Coil can have, but not give you that fear that you're gonna bottom out really hard if you're trying to hit really big stuff. So if you're really set on riding Coil and your bike can handle a Coil suspension, it's probably a good idea maybe to look into something like Cane Creek and see those kind of coils that they offer that progressively ramp up for you, just to ensure that you're riding on the proper feeling and travel movement. All right, so let's get into the bread and butter, per se, of air versus coil. And we're gonna start diving into the pros and the cons of both air and coil. Got a little bit of tear in my eye here because, I'm sad as we're, progressing so fast through the video, but let's break it down. So the pros of air. With the pros of air, the number one thing, it's all about adjustability. Air suspension is very easily adjustable. And what I mean by this is if you have a shock pump, you can easily adjust your air suspension to fit exactly how you are as a rider. It's basically one suspension to rule them all, right? So if you're gonna take your suspension to Mordor, make sure you go with air because it's one to rule them all. Another great thing about air suspension is its weight. It's much lighter than a coil suspension in that it doesn't have a big metal wound spring wrapped around it. It's just an air tube with a volume of gas basically being compressed up and down through its travel. And another great thing is if you find yourself out riding and you really want to reduce that kind of travel as you're climbing up hills, they have these pedal lever assist buttons back here on your rear suspension, which is an easy swipe on it. We get the joke there on swipes, but it's an easy swipe on there and you can climb up there without losing that progressiveness up your hill. All right, so let's get into the cons of air, and these are the things that a lot of people care about. So what's wrong with it, and what does it have that might affect me in making a decision on which choice to make? Well, the cons of air is, number one, it's gonna need more frequent maintenance. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of seals and movement going on here, and as dirt and things get into those seals, they can mess them up. So it's important to really maintain your air suspension. I would recommend every 12 months if you're a pretty serious rider, just to keep it movement, make sure those seals and everything are ready to go. Another thing here is that the small bump sensitivity is going to be greatly reduced due to the stiction. And it's taking a lot more force to get that travel to initiate. So typically that little stuff that happens, you're gonna feel a little bit more because it's gonna take a little bit more impact and inertia there to get it to start moving through its travel. And this is due to that word that we went over called stiction. And lastly, say you're doing really long descents and it's gonna be moving a lot through that travel in and out, air shocks can tend to heat up, and that's again because of those seals are so tight around that stanchion as it's moving through its reservoir. Basically it overheats, and as it gets really hot it becomes loose. And with that loosening of its movement, it basically kind of takes away from that progressive volume of air, and you're going to feel things a lot more, maybe not what you had initially intended. So those are some of the cons you should consider when looking at air. All right, so let's get into the pros of coil suspension, and that is primarily 100%, it's all about feel. This is a very plush experience when it comes to suspension. We know that it's very linear by nature. It's going to progress, or it's going to move through its travel very, very predictable. It's going to move at a 1-to-1 ratio if you take the whole frame and all the leverage ratio we were considering earlier. As a coil, it just moves right through its coil suspension. It moves through it at the same predictable rate. So if you point that coil suspension downhill, it's going to eat up whatever's underneath it, and it's going to give you that plush experience. So with that though, it also has this idea that it doesn't have to deal with stiction. Something that you're going to deal with when it comes to air suspension is that immediate need of force to get it to start moving. With coil suspension, from the start, you're feeling that plush, you're feeling that supple feel, it's eating up everything you want, and it's going to give you that great riding experience if that's what you're looking for. Some other great things about coil suspension is it has less seals and things like that that need to be worked on there. So you're not going to have to be maintaining it all the time or getting it rebuilt, because once you have that proper spring set on there, you're just going to be ready to ride. All right, so now that we've gone over the cons of air, and we're looking now and saying, well, what are the cons of coil? Because I'm trying to make a decision, and we understand that. So coil here has a few cons here, or things you should consider to help make your decision. And the first one is if you're looking for a really playful and kind of nimble bike, you're looking to get real poppy on it, most coil suspension is not going to offer you that. It's because of that plush, all about the feeling type of perspective that coil brings. It's not going to have that, necessarily that real poppy kind of feeling with the bike. But what it does have is the opposing perspective here is if you're riding really like harsh chunder and you're going over like gnarly rock terrain all the time, the coil is going to eat that up and create a very plush implanted perspective. That wheel is going to just immediately eat up everything through its travel. So that is one of the cons there. If you're looking for that poppy nimbleness, the coil is not going to be able to offer that for you so much. Although things may be changing in the future, and if that's the case, we'll make sure to do a video to kind of go over, typically as suspension progresses through its technology. But another con here is that when you first get into coil, it's not so much the adjustability like we heard as a pro for air. With this is you have to buy different coil springs to find that exact weight and that ratio and that spring rate that you're looking for. So that could be a con to some of you. If you're looking and you're getting into coil, you may need to buy 1, 2, maybe 3, different coils to find that proper feeling that you're really looking for. But the benefit here though to add to the con is once you find that right one, you're set and you're ready to get that experience. So those were the pros, those were the cons. I hope those help answer some of those decisions. But maybe you're still a little confused. I would just say that both are great options. You can't really go wrong as long as you're going with what the bike said based on the leverage ratios. If you know the type of terrain you're more likely to face. In today's age of suspension, they know what they're doing, they're giving you the right feel, and you're going to be able to experience exactly what you want. All right, so now that we've kind of gone over, all the things and understandings are related to air versus coil, I wanted to add a couple cool new technological advances that are coming into the suspension world and that have kind of been here for a while that maybe you're not aware of. So for example, maybe you're on an air fork and you want to try more of a coil perspective. Some of the great things is companies like Push here, they offer you conversion kits to basically transform your fork into more of a coil perspective. Other cool pieces of technology that we offer here at Jenson is like this MRP. This is a ramp control, and basically this will sit into the air side of your fork, and you can adjust the progressiveness of your fork through its travel. Say maybe you don't want to put volume spacers in like we've talked about and gone over in episode 1. Again, if you didn't watch that video, make sure you do. But it's simply a turn of the knob versus taking things apart and putting in spacers and reducers. But it allows you that even more adjustment and that means to create the most ultimate ride that you can get out of your suspension. So although we've gone over air versus coil, there's these great advancements that are coming out that offer you even more ways to manipulate your suspension, to put a coil system in an air shock, to ramp up and create more progression in an air shock without taking things apart and putting in volume reducers. The companies out there, they want to make sure you're riding super hard. They want to make sure that you're enjoying your time on your bike. So they're constantly creating great things. So if you're looking for any of that information and further, we'll make sure to link all these products down below, so check them out. If you have questions on these, make sure to reach out to our Gear Advisor pros. They know even more knowledge about them and how they relate specifically to your bike or your riding style, as they're out there riding each and every day. They're testing these products, they know how they feel, they know what they do exactly, so reach out to them if you have any questions. So let's conclude real quick on this video. All right, so that was a lot of information here for this second episode in our All About Suspension series. And we kind of dove in, I guess, to really idea of, do I want air or do I want coil? And what we realized was, if you're looking for a lot of adjustability, you don't mind having to maintain your suspension system, you don't mind having that little bit of stiction at the beginning of your travel, then air suspension was the way to go. If you like that all about plush, super supple riding, you're looking at getting, real like chunder type of experiences, rock terrain, you want your bike to stay planted, then you want to go with the coil suspension. But also remember, like we mentioned previously, is it's about the leverage ratio. You want to make sure that whatever type of suspension system that you have is creating that ramp up with what your bike is. And so again, I'll remind you that if you don't know what your bike's leverage ratio is, be sure to click the link that we have down here in the bio, where it'll take you to a full layout of all the bike. You can look at whatever bike you're maybe considering or the bike that you have and understand if you're trying to make a decision to switch or which type of suspension you want to ride. This helps break that understanding down. And as always, we love to see you out there on social media, so be sure to follow us at Jenson USA, hashtag We Keep You Pedaling, hashtag Jenson USA. Why don't you leave us a comment down whether you're Team Air or you're Team Coil, or maybe which one you're thinking about considering, because we'd love to hear from you. I'll make sure personally to respond to all of you. And just say hi and say if I agree with you or not, but chances are I'm probably going to agree with everything you say because I think they're both great. So as always, as I say it at the end of every video, because I truly and honestly mean it, keep pedaling. All right, and we just wanted to add something real quick here, because here on our videos with Jenson, we love to add little things here. If we say 5 reasons, we're gonna give you 6. Well, now that we've talked in here all about this, why don't we go around to our headquarters here in Riverside, California, and ask some of our employees maybe what system they're running and why they run it. Are they Team Air? Are they Team Coil? And why? So let's go check out a couple people. All right, so we got Shaggy here at Jenson. Are you Team Air or are you Team Coil, and why?
I like air because I ride in the rocks all the time.
Sick. What up, dude? All right, are you Team Air or Team Coil, and why?
Team Air.
Team Air, why?
Cross-country background.
Awesome. All right, let's keep asking. All right, dude. Team Air, Team Coil, and why?
I'm gonna go with Air because I haven't ridden a Coil yet.
Sick.
That's my only thing. And
all
I
right.
ride a hardtail, so it's a little harder there to make that decision.
Always love for the hardtails. All right, let's keep going. Who's getting picked? Who's getting picked?
What's up, man?
Are you Team Air or Team Coil when it comes to suspension, and why?
Coil in the back, air in the front.
Sick. Oh, there he is. These dudes are working super hard, so let's keep going. I don't want to interrupt him too long. Okay, moving on. All right, dude. Are you team air or team coil, and why?
Team air, because I've ran a coil before, and I like the adjustability of the air. Like I can just set it up for my weight perfectly instead of having to look for the right coil and stuff like that.
Perfect. Sick. All right, dude. Are you team air or team coil, and why?
Air. Air is just the adjustability of it.
Sick.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely.
Thank you. All right. The suspense is wild. Here he is. Let's go. All right. Are you team air or team coil, and why?
Team air.
Why?
Because you can adjust your suspension on the fly. And the holiday season's coming up. We're gonna.
Amazing. All right. Another team air. All right. We have Mike, our CEO here, and we're going to ask him the question, is he team air or team coil, and why?
Well, I would have to say I am team air, more because I'm cross country, and when I think of coil, I think of downhill. So,
awesome.
Team air.
Awesome.
All the way.
Thank you.
All right.